The honourable member for Cartwright-L'Anse, Clair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm always happy when I have the opportunity to stand on my feet and speak on behalf of the beautiful district of Cartwright-L'Anse, Clair, and indeed today Labrador as a whole, all of Labrador, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to Bill 42, an act to amend the Electoral Boundaries Act, and Mr. Speaker, I want to say up front, for the record, there's no question where the official opposition stands on this act that would see the number of seats in the House reduced. Because, Mr. Speaker, it was just 2 years ago that our leader was talking about this, 2 years ago. So nobody should question where the support, where the official opposition stands on this. And, Mr. Speaker, I could go on and give many other examples of things that our leader and this opposition have talked about, and eventually it catches on the other side, and they too say, yes, a good idea, like MHA pension reform. But, Mr. Speaker, my focus for the next 20 minutes is going to be on subsection 15(6). There was, the last time we saw the Electoral Boundaries Act brought in, Mr. Speaker, under 15(6), there was a provision brought in for Labrador. And in that, Mr. Speaker, it talked about 4 proposed districts. And they moved away from there was provision made for them to move away from the 10% and the 25% because there was a recognition that there was unique challenges in Labrador, an area that you could put New Brunswick and PEI and Nova Scotia, all of the Atlantic provinces into. Very challenging, Mr. Speaker, to travel within Labrador and to and from Labrador. Mr. Speaker, we have a Premier that I believe it probably takes him about 10 minutes to travel from one end of his district to the other. So clearly, Mr. Speaker, we have a serious lack of understanding when it comes to the needs and the challenges of moving around Labrador. Not a serious misunderstanding when it comes to going to Labrador to take things out, and I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to use my time, Mr. Speaker, to look at the Mahoney Commission in 1993. I'm going to talk about the review, the Electoral Boundary Review of 2006, and I hope I get a number of other opportunities because, Mr. Speaker, there's some very important things that need to be said here about Labrador. People need to understand, and they're not decisions and they're not things that can be talked about, Mr. Speaker, in a short period of time. Mr. Speaker, it's been prior to 1979 since Labrador has been without 4 seats. And to take away from Labrador right now that big land, it would be to regress Labrador put Labrador back decades, Mr. Speaker. And when I picked up this proposed bill and I read subsection 15(6) of the Act is repealed, to take away, to revoke, cancel. It's just, it's hard to accept, Mr. Speaker, that somebody so void of understanding and that knows so little. And I wonder, Mr. Speaker, how many on the government side haven't even been to Labrador. There's lots of things I don't know, Mr. Speaker, but if there's one thing I do know, it's Labrador. It's where I was born and raised. It's near and dear to my heart. I'm very well travelled in the whole province, and I've been fortunate to travel beyond, Mr. Speaker. And there's few places that I have been where I have seen the challenges of the Labrador people, Mr. Speaker. And I think there's some people that needs to be educated on that. And when I hear that the Premier is out in a scrum talking about the opposition wants to delay that, it turns my stomach, Mr. Speaker. I don't need to reiterate examples here today of where we have rushed decisions and the price that we have paid in the province because of that. But I can tell you one thing, as the member for Cartwright-L'Anse, Clair, and one of only 4 people sitting in this House today for Labrador, I will not be rushed in a debate when I want to bring up important points about Labrador and why the decisions that were made, why they were made, Mr. Speaker. Today we have 4 seats. There's 2, Mr. Speaker, sitting across from me in the seat of government. We work for the people, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell you right now, the people of Labrador are outraged about this. They're outraged. This is just feeding the ammunition of separatism. This is just more segregation. This is more alienation, Mr. Speaker. And I challenged the Minister for Labrador yesterday when I was up, and I challenge him again, the member for Lab West and the member for Lake Melville. stand up with your people. It's the people that puts us here, and we're all going to see in a few months that it's the people that can put us out. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I am a person that I stand on the courage of my convictions. If that means standing alone at my own table, Mr. Speaker, make no mistake about it, I will do that. I would rather walk out of this place, Mr. Speaker, and know that I stood for something than to toe a line with people, Mr. Speaker, because that's just who I am. Mr. Speaker, after decades of taking away natural resources with very little coming back to the people, we're now going to strip away, Mr. Speaker, one of the members. And I want to talk about the role of a member. You know, when you look at the role of a member in rural communities, it's very different than the role of a member in urban areas, Mr. Speaker. And I talk to other members, and I know some of the workload, Mr. Speaker, you know, we have lost so much in services in small communities, and more you see people relying on the constituency office. And now this government wants to do an attack on democracy, Mr. Speaker, and take that away. I want to talk about, I'll talk about, Mr. Speaker, travel to Cartwright-L'Anse, Clair. And maybe if some people wants to get up on the other side and talk about the time it takes them to travel to their district, I would welcome that. Mr. Speaker, when the House is sitting, when I leave here, Mr. Speaker, I fly for 3 hours on a plane to Goose Bay, and then I get in a vehicle and I drive 420 kilometres. And during the 2 days I am home, Mr. Speaker, I'm probably getting in my vehicle and I'm driving 200 kilometres to Cartwright, and I'm attending an event, and 200 kilometres back, and the next day I'm getting in my vehicle and I'm driving 420 kilometres back to Goose Bay, and then I'm getting on a plane for 3 hours, I'm coming back, I'm getting ready to come in the House and be a voice for the people. But there's a shortcut, Mr. Speaker. I can take the shortcut. I can get on a plane and I can fly for 2 hours to Quebec, to another province. And after my 2-hour flight, I can get in my vehicle and I can drive on 40-year-old pavement for half of it, and on a gravel road for the other half, Mr. Speaker. And then I'm only driving 275 kilometres. And maybe while I'm home I'm going to drive 140 kilometres to St. Louis for an event and 140 kilometres back. That's what we're dealing with challenges, Mr. Speaker. Now, if you want to talk about accessibility and the challenges that whoever the member for Cartwright-L'Anse Clair is, Mr. Speaker, we're getting on a skidoo and we're travelling over sea ice to the people of Williams Harbour, because the people of Williams Harbour matter in this province just as anyone else, Mr. Speaker. Or I'm getting on a ferry, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to Black Tickle. Or, Mr. Speaker, I'm getting on a helicopter, if there is one, and I'm going to Norman Bay. Mr. Speaker, I talked about the vastness of Labrador, the almost 300,000 square kilometres. You could fit the island into Labrador twice. And I'm just talking about one tiny section of Labrador, Mr. Speaker, one tiny part of Labrador. I could talk to you all day, until the 10 o'clock tonight, Mr. Speaker, about the challenges of getting around a district. Mr. Speaker, Tom Marshall, former Premier Marshall, a very well-respected man in this House and in this province. As I was doing some of my research, Mr. Speaker, my attention was drawn to former Premier Marshall up in the House on the 22nd of March 2007, and at that time he was talking about the formula that was in place did not apply to Labrador. We do not want the numbers game to hurt the people of Labrador, Mr. Speaker. A wise man. Every Premier, Mr. Speaker, since the early 90s have looked at Labrador as different. But the arrogance of this government, I'm not surprised, Mr. Speaker. I'm not surprised at all to see a bill come in that says the Act is to be repealed and there is no difference for Labrador. Mr. Speaker, I would love to see him if Labrador does go off and become Canada's newest territory. What will happen then? Can you blame the people for being upset, Mr. Speaker? When you look at the biggest project in the history of this province, Muskrat Falls, where's it happening, Mr. Speaker? It's happening in Labrador. Voisey's Bay, a huge contributor to the GDP of this province, Mr. Speaker. Where is Voisey's Bay? It's in Labrador. Mr. Speaker, IOC, that have been contributing to this province for decades, Mr. Speaker. And where is IOC? It's in the district of the member for Lab West. The member for Lab West, I've sat at many board tables with him over the years, and he knows the challenges of Labrador. Do we really want to regress? Do we want to go back in time? Had this government allowed an independent commission to take its time and to start this process in 2016 and to move us into 2019, maybe things might have been changed in some of the communities, Mr. Speaker. I have Williams Harbour. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention them again. 16 people on an island. They wanted to go. They didn't want to go, but all the services were stripped away, and they have no other choice. And they are stranded there for a couple of years, waiting on this government to make a decision on what they're going to do about relocation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 1993, when the Mahoney Commission looked at Labrador and the electoral boundaries, special consideration was made for Labrador when they were redrawing the electoral boundaries of the province, because they understood one size do not fit all. Mr. Speaker, in this province we have many, many rural communities, many unique areas, Mr. Speaker, and for the Premier to come out in a dictatorial way with a number of 38 and with a specific number of 13,000, Mr. Speaker, was wrong. It goes against democracy, and that's why I'm happy to be able to stand here today and debate it, Mr. Speaker, because one size does not fit all. Sometimes, Mr. Speaker, in an urban area, to add 3 or 4 city streets to a member's portfolio, Mr. Speaker, to broaden a district, it does not mean, Mr. Speaker, that you're adding extra municipalities and the work that takes. It does not mean, Mr. Speaker, that you're adding fire halls and all of the work that takes. And in those urban areas, Mr. Speaker, there's many community services that people can go to have things done. It is completely black and white, Mr. Speaker. The Mahoney Commission was tasked with deciding the number and description of electoral districts throughout the province. And the original mandate, Mr. Speaker, made mention to Labrador directly to ensure that geographic considerations, including the community of interest of residents of those communities north of Lake Melville. It mentioned that. Mr. Speaker, I've heard several members opposite today mention the Aboriginal seat in Labrador. And, Mr. Speaker, I have great respect for my colleague here, the member for Torngat. And yes, he does. The majority of the people that lives in his district are Aboriginal people. But, Mr. Speaker, what a blatant disrespect for the people in Labrador of Aboriginal descent that live outside Torngat, Mr. Speaker. I have more Innu and Inuit in some of my communities than the member has in his, Mr. Speaker, and I have it here, and if time permits me I will get. When you look at the number of Inuit in Natwashish, maybe 30 compared to 90 in Cartwright, Mr. Speaker. What blatant disrespect for those people. Do they not matter? Only north, and that's why that seat is being protected, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the first proposal that was made by the Commission in '93, the first proposal put forward was that Labrador would have 3 seats plus 1 district that would come of Labrador. And it was felt that this was necessary in order for it to follow its mandate, quotient at that time, the numbers game. Would have meant a reduction in representation from Labrador. At that time, Mr. Speaker, proposed combined district was Eagle River, Strait of Belle Isle, and then it was the Labrador coast from Red Bay to Clair as far south would go with the Great Northern Peninsula to Plum Point. That's what was looked at, Mr. Speaker, 22 years ago when it was looked at that possibly some of Labrador's seat would be taken, maybe a half a Labrador seat. Guess what happened, Mr. Speaker? When the Public Commission went out to do their work, the Independent Commission, this is what they heard. They heard that North and West Labrador is different from the coast. That's what they heard, that the coast of Labrador needed its own representation. They heard loud and clear, Mr. Speaker, that Labrador needed 4 seats to properly govern that geographic area. In order for these people to have a voice, in order for the vote of these people to matter, Mr. Speaker, because of the vast geography, because of the accessibility challenges, issues, and the transportation challenges, Mr. Speaker, because of the culture. We have 3 Aboriginal groups, Mr. Speaker, and they do not all reside, Mr. Speaker, in Lake Melville or in Torngat. We have many Aboriginal people, Mr. Speaker, that reside in Cartwright-L'Anse, Clair, and many Aboriginals that reside, I would suspect, in Lab West. Actually, many from my district of an Aboriginal descent that have relocated to Lab West. Mr. Speaker, what the Commission also heard at that time and what they concluded was districts should be cohesive units with similar history and people. People living in Labrador and in the Straits District would be the minority due to their separate issues from Newfoundland and that their voice wouldn't be heard. That's what the Commission heard, Mr. Speaker, and they listened. They listened because it was important to the Commission that people, no matter where you reside in this province, in this legislature, we are here to represent all of the people of Newfoundland and Labrador. And, Mr. Speaker, because their voice would not be heard, that was one of the reasons things stayed the status quo and the 4 seats stayed. And, Mr. Speaker, what is the fairness now? What is the equality in bringing this forward now? Where is democracy now? And you know, one of the things, Mr. Speaker, that the Commission heard when they looked at this in '93 is that geography shapes the way of life in Labrador. It shapes the way of life. And they added a comment that said, from their own travels in Labrador trying to hold the hearings, we can attest to that. Mr. Speaker, I don't know if the Minister of Finance, who was up speaking on the bill earlier, I don't know if he's ever been to Labrador. But I would, have you been to Labrador? I don't know. But I would, no. Well, I would invite him. I would invite him to come with me, pack an extra suitcase, because if we're going up to take the ferry, now we might be there, we could be there 9-10 days waiting for the ferry, Mr. Speaker, coming into Labrador, take extra clothes, and it depends if somebody over there thought about requesting icebreaker support and a lot of variables that come into play. After we're there, Mr. Speaker, 9 or 10 days, we might be told you're not stranded, you can go around and enter into Labrador another way. We might have to drive 3,000 kilometres, Mr. Speaker, and a number of ferries around another way. I'm not making this up, Mr. Speaker. This is Labrador. This is the big land. This is some of the things, Mr. Speaker, that make us different. But does that mean that we deserve less representation? 48 members sitting in this legislature and we only have 4 seats as it is, and now somebody has got the gall and the audacity to say, let's come out with a number, 13,000 people. Let's put a big flux of seats on the Northeast Avalon and let's abolish rural Newfoundland and Labrador, and that means taking Labrador down at the same time. People see through it, Mr. Speaker. They see through it. I have been inundated with emails and phone calls over the last number of days. Mr. Speaker, the Commission in '93 heard that a split seat would be a step backwards. And, Mr. Speaker, at the end, the Commission said, finally, the Commission can only report that in our unanimous opinion, changing the status quo and eliminating any one of the present Labrador districts would not be a positive move. Eliminating any one of the present Labrador districts would not be a positive move. But all of a sudden today, from a tired and weary and an arrogant government who've spent a decade of not listening, who've squandered millions and millions, and now they come out, well, the area that's been good to us, the part of the province that have been good to us, that have given us Boise State, it's giving us Muskrat Falls, it's giving us IOC, you know, everything is not perfect in Labrador. There's a lot of infrastructure needs, and sometimes they stand up in the House and they complain about things, and that's taken the shine off. Let's take them down a notch. Let's take another member from them. Mr. Speaker, this is far from over. This is only the beginning, Mr. Speaker. And what it have done, Mr. Speaker, as I've alluded to earlier, is it have revived a sense of alienation and isolation and frustration and disempowerment. Mr. Speaker, I don't know how some of these people over there can sleep at night. They're sitting there and they're going to go down in the history books. And in 30 years' time, Mr. Speaker, people are going to look back and say, who was there when they talked about reducing the seats in Labrador? And what did they have to say? That's why, Mr. Speaker, the weight of it is on me today. When somebody looks back in 30 years, some student is doing research and they want to say, who were the elected people for Labrador at that time and what did they have to say? Make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, I will be on record for identifying identifying all the reasons why Labrador do need the fair seats. It's time for somebody to start speaking up for Labrador, Mr. Speaker, and to start treating them with some fairness and some respect for all of Labrador, what they have given to this province, Mr. Speaker. And I've only gotten part way through the 93 Mahoney Commission, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward, because I haven't even touched the best of the stuff, Mr. Speaker, from the 2006 Electoral Boundary Review, and I look forward to taking my place again on behalf of the people of Labrador. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.